How about you guys?
Good, man. Tom, I'm pumped about this session. So this history session today. So we're going to go back, kind of share some stories about the city up north, or what do you call the city up north, Tom?
The Lake Erie football team established by Paul Brown in 1946.
Yes. So let's talk about. I mean, I think there's a lot of fans, Tom, that just don't know how important this game was to Paul Brown and his family, and even to today. You know, Troy and Katie and Mike and that front office. This is a very important game with the history that happened there. So let's go back a little bit and kind of, in 1946, Paul Brown founded that team. Okay.
He was coaching at the Great Lakes Naval Academy, where he was a naval officer during World War II. He just didn't coach. He had a lot of duties for the Navy, but he also coached the football team there, which, shock of all shock, Paul Brown put together became a very powerful team, beat some very, very good college teams during that time. Ended up founding the Cleveland Browns with some investors. In fact, the original owner, I believe, owned a cab company up there. But and immediately in the All-American Football Conference, dominated, won all 4 championships, and the Browns very quickly became more popular than the NFL Rams in Cleveland, and the Rams headed west to Los Angeles. And from that, I think what's even more astounding is for the next 6 years, starting in 1950, when the Browns moved to the NFL, 10 consecutive years, 4 in the All-American Football Conference, his first 6 in the NFL, Paul Brown's teams played for the championship. Just 10, going to the Super Bowl 10 consecutive years. And then they played in 2 more championships out there. I believe he was up there for 17 years and had 16 winning seasons.
Yep. And it's crazy. This Thursday will be the 93rd game. I'm sorry, the 94th game that they play against each other. The Bengals are 51-42. Winning record against the city up north. But in 1963, this is where it gets crazy, right? So Art Modell was one of the majority owners, barely majority owner. In 1963, he gets fired by Art Modell. They didn't get along. Paul didn't like him and vice versa. But the straw that broke the camel's back basically was Paul Brown traded their star halfback Bobby Mitchell for the rights to Ernie Davis, who broke all Jim Brown's records at Syracuse. At Syracuse, Paul Brown didn't tell Art Modell that he did that. Art Modell didn't find out until he was talking to the owner from the Washington Redskins. So in 1963, that's what got him fired. And the crazier thing about that was the timing of Art Modell firing Paul Brown. There just happened to be a strike. The newspapers were on strike in the Cleveland area, and they fired him right when the strike started. So the media strike limited the news about this getting out in the greater Cleveland area.
Art Modell still took a lot of heat. He took a lot of heat nationally. Everybody said, this is inconceivable. It's unexplainable. It's inexcusable. And I think really what made it worse was the reason, the method, and how he went about it. He came in, had a very big ego. He wanted the Cleveland Browns to be about him. Now here's Paul Brown, who's built one of the greatest dynasty, not just in football, but in all of sports and all of sports history. It's still true to this day. Art Modell needed it to be about him. And it wasn't going to be about him while you had Paul Brown there.
Right.
So he did he went behind the scenes. He did his best to stir things up. Players that might have grumbled or rolled their eyes at something, he got them angry and, made it as uncomfortable as possible and still, fired him. Paul still had a contract with the Browns, so he was a little bit in purgatory. Semi-retired to La Jolla, California, where he did some light scouting for the Browns, but was really working to get the franchise, his next team, which they wanted to be a expansion team, and fortunately ended up being in Cincinnati.
What's crazy, I didn't know about this either, Tom, that there was an 8-year contract. When they fired him, he was just starting I guess I can't remember what 8 years of a contract left. He was getting paid over $82,000 a year every year from Art Modell and the Cleveland Browns through retirement. He's going out in California playing golf.
Playing golf, watching a few San Diego Charger football games, and sending in scouting reports back to Cleveland, which
that's right.
But and right after he left in 1964, the Browns won another title with Paul Brown's team using Paul Brown's system, Paul Brown's players. And it's interesting you brought up the Bobby Mitchell trade. That was for Ernie Davis for the first pick in the draft. And what Paul Brown saw was another Jim Brown. And if he could have two Jim Browns in the backfield, they would be unbeatable. And, and they would have been, unfortunately, tragically, Ernie Davis got cancer and passed away.
It's crazy. So Paul Brown investors, they get a team here in Cincinnati. That inception of that team, the first year they played in the AFL, 1968, 1969, knowing when he got the franchise that there was going to be a merger at some point soon. So in 1970, Paul Brown's strategic plan, put in place many years prior, 3 to 5 years prior to that, was to get to the NFL and to be able to play the city up north. So he comes to Cincinnati in 68. 1970, the NFL and the AFL merge, and they just happen to put the Cincinnati Bengals in the city up north conference. And Paul Brown will get 2 shots every single year against that team.
Well, actually, and Art Modell was a little bit of a stickler. When they first talked merger, he said that, put his nose up in the air and said his team would never play an AFL team.
Right.
When they came to the agreement, they had to move a couple of NFL teams over into what would then become the AFC. The Browns, the Steelers, and the Colts all moved, and shock of all shocks, Art took the money and made the jump, which put him in the same division with the Bengals. And it made for a very heated rivalry, I'm sure, for nobody more than Paul Brown. But he came right out to him their first year together. The Bengals won the division, so Paul Brown would always have that when they were on quasi-equal footing. Paul Brown went up. The first game was in Cleveland, which was very close. It was a very good game. It was very close. And then down here, Virgil Carter had an incredible day at Riverfront Stadium, and the Bengals beat the division title.
Let's talk about that 1970 season a little bit, just the city at north versus Cincinnati, right? So they got to play in the 70s. They actually played teams in their division in the preseason. So I've got several things here from a memorabilia, all related to the city at north versus Cincinnati rivalry. So the very first time the Bengals played the city up north was in a preseason game. And Blanton Collier, who was a very close friend of Paul Brown's when he was up in city up north.
Top lieutenant.
Yeah, absolutely. Assumed head coaching responsibilities up there when Paul Brown left. So this cover of this game day program for a preseason game, the Bengals wind up winning that game 31-24. Paul Brown played his starters the whole game, this game, to make sure that he beat the city up north. So this is that game day program from preseason 1970, and the Bengals win that game.
One of those games, was that one of the games up in Columbus? They called that the Woody Hayes Bowl.
Actually, that one was here in Cincinnati. That's funny you said that, because and then the very first time they played in 19 – I have the wrong one here. But the very first time they played in 1970, early in the year, the Bengals didn't start out the year that well, but they finished really strong. But later in the year, the very first time the city up north comes down to Cincinnati, the Bengals beat them and beat them 14-10. So Paul Brown's first regular season victory against the city up north here in Cincinnati. And I just can't even imagine Paul Brown probably that night sitting in his, giant recliner with a scotch and a cigar, just with a big smile, ear to ear, loving the victory that night.
I don't think PB smoked, but I do know several players talked about when they won that game. And at first, you remember in the 80s, the big Sam Weich wouldn't shake Chuck Noll's hand. In the AFL at the time, Paul's first couple years there was a bit of a custom just because there had been some hard feelings and people getting hot on their counter. AFL coaches did not shake hands after the game. They just kind of nodded or waved to each other and went on to their locker room, which was how Paul handled it with Blanton Collier, the first game up there and the second game down here. But there's a really neat clip, if you can anybody ever finds it, of there's a clock ran out of that game. I mean, forget about being a 60-year-old man. He looked like a 18-year-old high school track star. He smiled, grinned, pumped his fist, and sprinted to the Bengals locker room. But and more than one player said of all the years they were with him, it was the only time they saw him truly get emotional.
Yeah, and I got a couple more things here, but Jamie, we have a short clip here. If you could play that short clip, there you go.
What wounded Paul Brown most was betrayal by his assistants.
They made an agreement amongst themselves never to contact my father. These people were his friends.
The word coming out of the Browns was the game had passed me by. I spent 5 years out of football. In fact, the matter is I was fortunate to get back into it because Pete Rozelle made it possible for me to do so.
There are a great number of people in pro football, including myself, would like to see Paul back with the game. He did so much for it.
In 1968, Paul Brown returned to pro football. It was no longer a black and white game, but a vibrant Technicolor world that he had created.
So you can see in Paul Brown's face in that interview, and even in Mike, man, there were some pain in that conversation. They were happy to get the opportunity to get back in.
Terrible. It took the majority of what was his life away from him, and just like he said, it was like just surgically removing a big part of his life and a big part of his family. That's
yep.
It was everything outside of his family to him, and those feelings resonated. I know Art Modell a couple times commented that, well, over time things calmed, and I think Mike himself kind of said, I have no recollection of that and no memory of that. Dave Lapham said that when the team bus pulled in a couple times to Municipal Stadium, and Paul would always be the first off, that one time Art Modell had just pulled up into his parking spot, and they were walking right at each other, going in different directions, and never a word was spoken. Yeah. So, no, I don't think that ever healed, and I can understand why.
Yeah, and it's
and the notion and the narrative that Art Modell tried to put out that the game had passed Paul Brown by was an absolute load of crap. 50 years later, the game was still trying to catch up. I mean, he was the first one that designed the receiver in the quarterback's ear to hear the play come in, variation of defenses, the short passing game. The West Coast offense came in after him, and his coaching tree is enormous and still continues to grow.
Right. Well, I've got a few things here. We'll finish with this. I've just got a boatload of games, home and away tickets here. I've got dozens and dozens of these games, but there's three of them that kind of stick out to me. Just to let you know how important this game was to the Brown family. When Paul Brown Stadium opened up in 2000, the very first game at Paul Brown Stadium was the City Up North. That ticket right there is that ticket stub from that game. So, Mike Brown requested that game to be the first game at Paul Brown Stadium because of the significance with his family in the City Up North. This is the very first game versus the City Up North. This is the very first game played against Paul Brown's Cincinnati Bengals versus the City Up North. And my first game, away game as a Bengals fan, was in 1989 against the City Up North. And it just happened to be a first time in Cleveland. We're driving, we get about half an hour outside, and it smelled like old bologna. It just stunk. I don't know, the factories out there. It was not smelling real good in Cleveland. I don't think it still does. But anyway, it snowed, and it wasn't white snow, Tom. It was dirty brown snow. That's what I remember about my first road trip to the City Up North in 1989. Bengals win that game. I think that might have been a Sunday night or Monday night game or something that year. But a lot of history. I hope everybody watching, a lot of people may know about some of this stuff, but this is a very big game. If Paul Brown was still alive today, the importance of this game is big time to him and his family.
And I think we're going to see our young team continue to grow Thursday night. I don't know what the final score is going to be, but clearly the trajectory is still up. Before you cut me off, Jimmy, can they punch off the guys up too?
Yeah.
James, do me a favor. I've been to Cleveland with Jimmy. Mandatory bed check is 10:30 for your sake.
We'll make sure he's tucked in and safe for you.
Thanks, Kyle.
I mean, I'm sure his Cleveland fan club is going to be there just waiting to welcome him to the city. But
they're going to know who you are.
As much of a celebrity as now, I think we have like 5 security detail coming, Secret Service guys, so we should be covered.
It's you two, 23 security guys?
Yeah, we're good. Tom, thanks again, buddy. We appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Tom.
Who day?